out of the 186 countries in the 2012 Trafficking in Persons report, the United States State Department finds 174 countries in which trafficking for the purpose of commercial sexual exploitation of children poses a serious problem. The United Nations Global Report on Trafficking in Persons that was published a few months ago in December 2012 states that in less than 3 years of the total trafficking victims, the number of child trafficking victims has risen to 27%. The United States Department of Labor reports in its last report that there are 134 products in 74 countries that are produced through forced labor and child labor. These products include gold, diamond, cotton, rice, and fish. Professor Judith, the Johns Hopkins University Bloomberg School of Public Health, in this symposium is addressing the most difficult challenge of our time. How do we protect our children from exploitation and abuse? And this Obama initiative and this symposium, which will be addressed by this distinguished group of leading scholars, policy makers, experts, and advocates, in fact, gives effect to Article 112 of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. Article 112 explicitly states that the President of the United States, through the relevant agencies and institutions, including this one, shall carry out research to examine, and I am quoting the Act, the interrelationship between trafficking in persons and global health risk. Consequently, we should think today and tomorrow about the medical consequences of human trafficking, especially child trafficking, which affects both physical and psychological health. Specifically, we should think about maybe violence against women, maybe drug and alcohol abuse, maybe HIV, AIDS, and other sexually transmitted infections. And we want to be careful not to focus our health research only on sex trafficking. We have to pay attention also to labor trafficking. In the United States versus Seljan, John W. Seljan, who was 85 years old, was arrested in Los Angeles airport on his way to the Philippines to have sex with two girls, ages 9 and 12. Seljan was carrying pornographic materials and was sentenced to 20 years in prison for attempting to have sex with children. Distinguished guests, obviously any effective response to commercial sexual exploitation of children should include addressing the four evils of commercial sexual exploitation: child prostitution, child pornography, child sex tourism, and child trafficking. Our former president, in his address to the United Nations back in September 2003, talked to us about the war in Iraq, but he also spoke about sex trade and sex tourism and human trafficking. I do not know whether these words are part of President Bush's library, because I was not invited to the opening ceremony. But what I know for sure is that there is a link among all these forms of sexual exploitation of children. We cannot address one and lose sight of the other three. We must address the four evils of commercial sexual exploitation of children. Consequently, from the podium, and if the dean allows me, from the premises of the Johns Hopkins University Bloomberg School of Public Health in Baltimore, I would like to send an email on behalf of our females to the U.S. Congress in Washington, D.C. Please amend Section 108 of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act and let us ask governments of foreign countries to report on what they are doing to combat child pornography. To be sure, the U.S. Congress has made significant progress. The Trafficking Victims Protection Act passed back in October 28, 2000, and was amended 4 times, in 2003, 2005, 2008, and 2013. And every time Congress amended the Act, which is now 122 pages long, Congress keeps an eye on our children, enhancing the penalty if the child is under the age of 14, and granting the child victim all benefits regardless of whether he or she is cooperating with law enforcement officials, and recognizing the human rights of children irrespective of their immigration status, and providing for the most important principle, and that is the principle of non-punishment of the victims. Distinguished guests, back in 2000, an international consensus was created that the international community was facing a crisis, a grave and serious crime, and something had to be done about it. Now we have 154 countries that are party to the United Nations Protocol on Trafficking, including the United States of America. And in spite of the weak human rights language of the protocol, we emphasize its calling to take into consideration, and I am quoting, the special needs of children. And we, in the anti-trafficking movement around the world, insist that the protocol provides for obligations to provide rights for victims, not merely recommendations. I do not interpret any of the provisions of the protocol to just make proposals or recommendations. The protocol is all about obligations to provide victims of trafficking with rights. And that is how we should interpret the Council of Europe Convention on Action Against Trafficking in Human Beings in relation with the United Nations Protocol. The convention, as stated in Article 39, is intended to enhance the protection of victims. This is also how we should interpret the Arab Charter on Human Rights, which explicitly prohibits exploitation of children and trafficking in children. The Charter, as stated in Article 43, is to be interpreted in light of the United Nations Convention on the rights of the child. Distinguished guests, if you ask me what is the legislative map around the world, here's my answer. It is a success story. At least 80 countries, as we speak, have a comprehensive anti-trafficking legislation. At least 64 countries have provisions in their penal code that criminalize all forms of trafficking, including sex trafficking in children. These laws expand the concept of human trafficking or trafficking in persons and shift the focus from slavery to exploitation. We have now a very expanded definition of human trafficking. We are shifting the focus from the narrow concept of slavery to the wider concept of exploitation. Giving birth to a child and taking the child away is a form of human trafficking under the Israeli law. Recruiting a child for the purpose of early marriage is a form of trafficking in the law of the Philippines. Moving children from Yemen to Saudi Arabia for the purpose of begging is a form of trafficking in the law of Saudi Arabia. And recruiting children for the purpose of committing an act of terrorism is a form of trafficking in the Lebanese law. And yes, we need fatwas from Muslim scholars that condemn killing our children in the name of religion. We need to utilize the good principles of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam that prohibit human exploitation and exploitation of children. The point I'm trying to make here today, and hopefully it will be taken into consideration today and tomorrow, is that if we want to combat sex trafficking in children, we have to recognize that there is a link between sex trafficking and other forms of trafficking. The first link that I would like to establish, the link between trafficking in children and child prostitution, child pornography, and child sex tourism. The second link that I am emphasizing is the link between sex trafficking on one hand and all these other forms of trafficking. And that's why in this country we enhance the penalty. When one recruits a worker for the purpose of labor, and then that person sexually exploits such worker, including domestic workers. As you know, in this town, and I'm referring to Washington, D.C., not Baltimore, you don't have to worry, there is a problem with domestic work. In the diplomatic community is a problem because we cannot prosecute diplomats even if they sexually abuse their workers under the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act. This brings me to, and I'm going to conclude because Professor Judith is looking at me, she's my boss, so I have to pay attention to her. That brings me to 3 specific challenges. I had 5, but I thought for sake of time limitations, I will limit myself to 3. I will use what Professor Judith just mentioned. She said gaps, omissions, that we have to think about today and tomorrow, and I would like to share with you. And in my judgment, they require sharing of best practices. We should not be talking about human trafficking and trafficking in children the way we were talking about trafficking in children back in 2000. We have 13 years of best practices that we must share, and I think if we ended this conference by tomorrow evening or tomorrow night with some best practices from around the world, some international, some comparative models, I believe we would have succeeded. First, numbers. They are difficult to obtain and even harder to verify. Congress recognized that in a very nice statement that I want to read for you. Congress in the Trafficking Victims Protection Act says the following: no known studies exist that quantify the problem of trafficking in children for the purpose of commercial sexual exploitation. And Article 112 tells us that we need an effective mechanism for quantifying the numbers of victims of trafficking on national, regional, and international levels. I don't think we have the numbers, and I think if we are thinking about research, I think we have to maybe design a methodology. How can we get numbers? I was thinking about the homeless children, for example, the unaccompanied children. We can start with that. We have numbers there, and then we move from this specific area to our area, trafficking in children. Second, and I have only three, prosecution. And it was mentioned many times in the opening remarks. We have a trafficking law in every state. Now, in the 50 states of the United States, including the great state of Maryland and the great state of Virginia, because I live in Virginia, I don't live in Maryland, we have laws. And these laws provide for very serious punishments. I read the last week the 50 state laws, and we are talking about 40 years and 50 years and life without parole. But here are some questions that we want to think about. First question: how many perpetrators are we prosecuting under these laws? Yes, we have good laws, but I'm not sure we're doing a good job when it comes to prosecution of those who commit the crime of trafficking. Second question: is the consent of the child victim would be considered a defense in these cases? Third question: how about knowledge of the age of the child? Fourth question: how about the statute of limitations? I am like to refer to Section 202 of the Protect Act. It says that we are not going to have a statute of limitations in any sex crime that involves children. So you ask the question in the 50 states, do we have statute of limitations? Absolutely, we shouldn't have any statute of limitations when it comes to sex crimes that involve children, including child sex trafficking. Are we punishing children for prostitution? Although such acts may be committed in relation to the act of trafficking itself, I see reports of punishment of children in prostitution for the act of prostitution, although the act is in relation to the act of trafficking itself. Finally, are we establishing a victim assistance fund to help our children who are subject to trafficking? Third, and finally, the most difficult challenge is demand. We must punish and go after the purchaser of sexual services. Prevention is not enough. Raising awareness is not enough. 9-5 of the United Nations Protocol is not enough. Here is a most recent case that just came out, United States versus Bonstru. The defendant responded to a series of internet advertisements for sexual contact with minors in exchange for money. This is how we use our internet. ICE responded with the defendant through multiple emails, and upon meeting and exchanging money for sexual acts, the defendant was arrested and charged with attempted commercial sex trafficking of a child. Guess what? The court concluded that the Trafficking Victims Protection Act does not of sexual services. It only applies to the traffickers. So if we are looking today and tomorrow and I'm going to conclude with this thought, if we are looking for an amendment to our law, let us think together about applying the Trafficking Victims Protection Act to the customer, the client, the purchaser of sexual services, the one who exploits our children. Thank you.